Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Stephen Cole. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Marc-Antoine Eyl-Mazzega to the programme. Mr. Eyl-Mazzega is Director of IFRI's Centre for Energy and Climate. Prior to that, he spent 6 years at the International Energy Agency, the IEA, notably as Russia and Sub-Saharan Africa Programme Manager, where he conducted oil and gas market analysis. He's also held various other positions, such as at the Robert Schuman Foundation, where he created and conducted the Ukraine Observatory to foster dialogue and expertise on Ukraine's political, economic and social transformations. Marc-Antoine, welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very kind invitation and introduction.
Well, to begin, let's provide a summary of your work, I think, at the IFRI Centre for Energy and Climate Change and the Ukraine Observatory at the Robert Schuman Foundation.
Sure. I think what we are trying to do is to basically use geopolitics and geoeconomics as the main focal point to analyze energy policies and energy market developments, both in Europe, within Europe, as we are engaged in an unprecedented economic and energy transformation, which aims to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and accelerate dramatically by 2030, but also between Europe and the rest of the world, that is mainly with the largest energy producers, consumers, and greenhouse gas emitters. And I think that makes us quite specific in the global setting of think tanks or wider institutions that work on energy and markets or policies. And I think that with the war in Ukraine, the weaponization of energy or of everything, as many say, I think we are here on a very interesting pathway.
Oh yes, Marc-Antoine, very much so. I mean, a year on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the global energy landscape has changed dramatically, and the world's dependence on fossil fuel consumption, including price, resource volatility, has come, I think, into sharp focus. And the economic disruption caused by the war has, I think, amplified calls for an accelerated energy transition. You talked about accelerating in 2030, and the ripple effects have been felt acutely. You recently commented the efforts against climate change have been severely hampered by the conflict in Ukraine. Why is that?
Sure. I think to start with, we have to remember that Gazprom and Russia were providing 1/3 of European gas supplies over past years. So this is tremendous. And as Russia was providing so much gas to Europe, the LNG market could be geared towards emerging economies beyond, the traditional importers like Japan or South Korea. So we had a chance to put more gas in the system, less coal, and to accompany the ramp up of renewables. And what happened then is that Russia started reducing its gas supplies to Europe, and which has strained immensely the energy market, which has basically prompted emerging economies to put more coal in their system, to put more oil in power generation, and which has prompted us in Europe to also put more gas into our electricity system and a little bit more of coal. So all in all, that was already very bad. The second aspect, which is very bad, is that we needed to count on a constructive Russia to address climate change, because Russia is one of the world's largest emitters. And with the war and its total isolation or near total isolation, clearly the Russian government is not focused anymore on addressing and fighting climate change. But as you said, Stephen, I think on the medium term, what we will see everywhere is two things. One is obviously an accelerated push towards renewable investments, and B, an increased focus on energy efficiency. And here in Europe, even a step beyond, which is towards energy sobriety. But so I think we have to see this in two phases. So the short term is looking pretty bad, but the medium term will see hopefully an acceleration in the low carbon solutions and technologies. But of course, this comes with many challenges related to inflation, to the availability of resources, related also to the availability of skilled workforce, and of course to the fact that then you need to bring in the flexibility technologies to ramp up grid investments, etc. So it's not going to be an easy road.
And a road Europe is trying to ease the way with the European Green Deal. As you know, it's a package of policy initiatives trying to set the EU on the path to a green transition. And that aim, that goal of reaching climate neutrality by 2050. That seems to be a catch-all term from very many different proposals. But what are the most significant, do you think, within the deal?
Well, the Green Deal indeed was presented 3 years ago, and since it was presented, it has undergone 3 unprecedented crises nobody would have expected, right? So the first was, so it's already an embattled strategy, I should say, but it's still alive, and actually it's being reinforced. So I'll say a few words on that in a second. But the 3 crises were, of course, first that you had to bring all the EU member countries on board, and that was extremely difficult because you have very different circumstances in Europe, and so of course you had to convince everyone to agree with the objectives, and that was achieved. The second crisis was COVID, of course, and the third crisis is now the geopolitical and economic shock from the war that Russia wages in Ukraine, and beyond, indirectly in Europe. So I think, having said that, the idea to with the Green Deal was a clear consequence of Russia's aggression and of the need to decouple from Russian energy supplies. And if you want to decouple, well, on the short term, there's only one solution, which is to save energy and try to import more LNG, liquefied natural gas. So this is what has been done, and actually Qatar played a little role in that too. But then if you look for the years beyond, well, then that means bringing much more renewables into the system, phasing out and the thermal engine and moving to the electrification of transport, which has also been acted. And it also means ramping up energy efficiency efforts. And it also means to basically develop the hydrogen economy for where it really makes sense. And so I think very important work has been ongoing in these directions. Much more funding has been allocated. And if I look into where we are now, I think we are well on track to have actually see this acceleration. Although, of course, it remains to be seen if we can really meet the very ambitious targets that we've set for ourselves for 2030.
Yes.
We are talking, just to give you one number, we are talking about installing 750 gigawatts of solar and wind within by 2030. So that's basically a factor of 4 in terms of annual capacity deployment. So it's just tremendous. So most likely we're not going to get there, but nonetheless, we'll see a very important acceleration. And what we still need to fix is the role of nuclear into all that. And that is quite a matter of tension currently, notably between France and Germany.
Indeed. I'm not going to get into that one at this stage, but there's no doubt a blockade, whether it's working or not is another question, but a blockade on Russian crude oil and refined products has been enforced, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere. Has the only effect been, though, to place a price cap on crude and refined products? And is this why Russian crudes and products sell at such a large discount to the posted prices?
Well, indeed, what we are now, after 1 year of Russia's war in Ukraine, is the European Union is no more importing Russian oil, crude and products, is no more importing Russian coal, is no more importing Russian wood products, and is no more importing Russian natural gas. At least the largest customers have been cut off from supplies from Gazprom via pipelines. So the situation indeed is extraordinary. Nobody would have expected something like that to happen, A, and B, for the European Union to still be, say it, alive after such a brutal decoupling. Now, we are alive, things are working. The energy system has been extraordinarily agile and has adapted and adjusted. Of course, at a huge cost. And when we talk about the oil supplies, what is striking is that the idea, of course, is not to prevent Russian oil from reaching global markets, because that would lead to a catastrophic situation. The idea is to reduce the rent that Russia benefits from selling its oil and products abroad, so that its war effort is being weakened. And I think from that perspective, it is working, because Russian oil continues to reach global markets. There is no dramatic oil supply crisis across the world. And it's also working because we see that the revenues that the Russian state can cash in from these exports are going down. So it's not to say that, you know, Putin's war effort will stop in 2 months because he's running out of money. No, but it's just another headache he has to face. And I think from that sense, it's pretty much working. Now, of course, it comes at a huge benefit for countries like India, Turkey, China, and other emerging nations who can now benefit from discounted oil imports from Russia. And it comes at quite a severe cost for us in Europe, because we have to pay more, obviously, for these supplies. But nonetheless, that's the price to pay if we want to support Ukraine, support international law, and bring back Russia to the negotiation table, and to ultimately give up its war in Ukraine.
So you believe Europe is coping, and Europe has survived the winter of 22 with no major gas supply issues. With stocks now high, it appears the winter of 23-24 should also be secure. Do you agree with that? And if it's true, will gas prices start to fall quickly now?
Well, we are in an extraordinarily good situation compared to the worst concerns we had a few months ago, when we looked into this winter and we said, wow, it's going to be really, really tight. And actually, what helped us was the weather. It was the fact that the Chinese took much less LNG compared, for example, 2021. And what helped us were the extraordinary adjustments that were made in the market by market players and policymakers to bring in a lot more supply. So now, indeed, as you said, Stephen, we are exiting the winter in a few weeks with much more gas in storage compared with previous years. So that's a real asset for 2023 and for preparation of the next winter. Now, the situation remains extraordinarily tight. If we are lucky, we get a good weather in summer, not too hot. We have no storms in the Gulf of Mexico. We have a relatively mild summer in Asia, and all that will help us. If we are not lucky and we get very, very hot summer, storms, and of course a cold winter starting earlier next year, well, then things will get really, really problematic. So
let's hope that El Niño and El Niña behave themselves.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, we are, and the interesting thing is, you know, there's not much you can do, but what has to continue happening is continued very strong efforts to save energy in a hurry, to maintain all the efforts, both in gas and electricity, because both are tied, of course. Yeah. And of course, with the low prices that you now have and the kind of relaxation mood everybody is in the market, this is a challenge. So far so good, but the problems in the next few months are not disappearing and are actually getting worse, because as you know, last year we had Russian gas until summer, and this year, we will not have these 4 or 5 months of Russian gas via pipelines. So that is missing in addition to last year. So it's an additional headache, right? And if you look at gas demand, well, I think we've reached the bottom of what we can do. Obviously, the market has adjusted. We've seen some sharp decreases in industrial demand and in the residential sector, but there's not much more that can happen. And so hence the need to continue the saving policies and to be very alert on that.
I just switch to COP, Marc-Antoine, and I wonder whether you were disappointed that COP27 focused, I think, more on abatement and damage compensation than really tackling how emissions could be curbed. And do you expect COP28 to move back to more concrete measures on climate change mitigation?
Yes, I think COP27 was disappointing in many regards, but however, I think it has shed some real good light into the realities of the global environmental and climate governance, which is that the interests between the different countries of the world are not aligned yet, and we see growing tensions between the North and the South, and we see, of course, growing tension over the role of hydrocarbons, and there is also a sense that people consider that 1.5 degrees is out of reach, so let's focus on adaptation and just continue as we are, because in any case, in the best case, we will not be able to stop global warming, so it's best just to shift to adaptation. And I think indeed, Stephen, from that angle, it's quite disappointing. But I think the COP28 that we'll see by year end comes in a different perspective, because we will have a strong COP presidency, which was not the case of Egypt. We will. I mean, the Emiratis are really willing to play a very substantive role. They are working on their own without any outside influence. And what is most important, in my view, is that the COP presidency will be handled by one of the largest oil and gas company in the region and in the world, which is a huge change, because to say the truth, we will only be able to address climate change if the oil and gas industry and if the oil producers are fully playing their role and are committed and are part of the solution. And so the only way that can happen is to have them take leadership. And so I think that's a good opportunity to do so.
I mean, some companies and countries believe climate change can be tackled within a business as usual model. I mean, hinting measures such as carbon capture, utilization, storage, hydrogen plants may be sufficient abatement tools. Is that, do you think, a viable approach now?
No, I don't think it's viable, but in a way, no, of course it's not viable, because we know that if we want to be on track for 1.5 degrees, we have to dramatically reduce demand for hydrocarbons, and then of course reduce also investments and production into hydrocarbons, and move to the other low carbon technologies, plus reduce energy demand. So that's, and of course, preserved biodiversity, etc., etc. So we are very far from that. But looking at this from the perspective of several hydrocarbon producers, well, they look into the world and see growing demand for oil, growing demand for gas, and of course that demand is not growing in the OECD countries, but it's growing in the emerging economies. And so their point is to say, look, the OECD economies might be already starting to see decline in demand, etc., but the rest of the world is just on a different track. And actually, the rest of the world is no way near to starting an energy transition. It is just basically diversifying its energy mix, basically adding renewables to coal, gas, and oil, right? And actually, they're right. Now, the problem is the following. If they stop there and say, okay, I'm just going to continue investing and to meet that increasing demand, I think they are just becoming part of the problem. What needs to happen is that these producers say, okay, we are going to accompany, of course, this growing demand, but we are going to double down on investing and helping to develop the alternative solutions, to invest basically in the renewables, to invest in the alternatives for the transportation sector, etc. That will ultimately bring also our clients in emerging economies on the right track. And this part is missing, and this part is still missing. And I think it can come now. And the other part that has been missing, but we see also there changes, is the idea that, well, you know, if you have an electricity system that 100% relies on oil and gas or on coal in addition, well, you can really double down on diversifying that. And I think if I look at Qatar, if I look at the UAE and even Saudi Arabia, there's some important changes happening there. And I think that's also promising from that angle.
We've talked about Ukraine and the Middle East, but drawing upon your expertise of Sub-Saharan Africa, do you think a meaningful energy transition can be achieved in the face of such an explosion of population on the continent?
Well, the thing about Sub-Saharan Africa is that there is no single energy transition pathway, right? And it's actually also a side remark for the rest of the world. There will be several energy transitions. There's no magic solution for that, etc. Now, what I see is that, of course, we hear the fact that, you know, Sub-Saharan Africa is just basically 1 or 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's a very, very tiny contribution to the global warming we've had so far. And that, of course,
that is an interesting point, isn't it? They've caused very little global warming, but are suffering terribly from climate change.
Absolutely. Not only did they cause very little, but regrettably, they are the ones that are going to be the biggest victims, right? Because they are heavily exposed and have little financial means and resources to protect themselves from these threats. So of course, the situation is terrible. Now, what should we do? I think there is an issue of money. There is an issue of de-risking investments. There is an issue of bringing a lot of these investments there, of ramping up skills, etc. But there is also a huge number of issues that Sub-Saharan African governments have to address, which is setting up a framework that is conducive to investments, you know, meeting rule of law requirements, having stable and transparent governance, and all that is also required if we are to basically altogether be able to ramp up the low carbon systems there, etc. And so this I see missing. And so, for example, Stephen, when I hear, you know, the calls for large investments into adaptation and emergency funding for a number of countries. Well, the problem is, if the government system in place is not right, I think we are just you know, it won't help.
Tilting at exactly.
And populations will be victims, right? So we have come out of this negative circle.
Just briefly, Marc-Antoine, because sadly we're running out of time, give us a quick view, an overall viewpoint on Africa's wind and solar power development.
I think we will see something extraordinary, which is a very hybrid development. What I mean by that is you will see a combination of systems that will add up. Notably, for example, in areas where you have the grids, people and industries will still deploy some decentralized autonomous solutions because the grid is not reliable. In areas where you don't have the grid, well, most probably the grid will never come because of the progress of the decentralized solutions at all levels. And then what we will see is increasingly a major fundamental problem to overcome, which is the debt-ridden national electricity utilities, which, you know, have a very poor record in terms of revenue collection, hence do not invest, hence cannot maintain the infrastructure, hence only are able to impose very high tariffs, which again convince the consumers not to pay or to go off-grid, etc., etc. So this will have to be addressed. But I think when we look look into education, it's not going to be one that will be based on the central network. It's going to be a hybrid one, a very decentralized with multiple solutions. But the key is, I think, to bring in investment, to de-risk that investment in countries, you know, where the currencies are very weak, and often there is no, you know, there is no even clear understanding of who owns what in terms of land ownership, etc. So a lot of work that needs to be happened there. But overall, I think yes, we will see a boom in solar. We will see a boom in decentralized systems. And one thing not to forget is not only is there the electricity access issue, but also the clean cooking access issue, which is often related. And again, here there is a huge scope for progress with new electric pressurized cookers, for example, who can really make a difference and are very cheap to be deployed at large scale. So yeah, the challenge remains tremendous. I think we see no real progress in terms of electricity access, but again, if you know, the Middle East, Europeans, others team up and really come up with a massive support in all various forms, and local governments do their part, I think we can really achieve a difference within a very short time period because of technological progress and new business models that are right now.
Well, that's tremendous to end on such a positive note. Marc-Antoine Eyl-Mazzega, you've provided us with some extraordinary insights into some important organizations and the critical areas of the world. I think particularly the outlook for Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. The Foundation looks forward very much to speaking with you again in the future. And thank you all for listening. Be sure to keep up to date with all of the Al-Attiyah Foundation's work by following us on Twitter and YouTube. But from me, Stephen Cole, and Marc-Antoine, it's goodbye.